Yesterday, while NASA was likely debating which shade of blue to use for their next mission patch, Harvard's Avi Loeb dropped a bombshell accusation that could completely shatter their credibility. He publicly claimed NASA is deliberately withholding critical data on 3I Atlas. And the data they're hiding? It could rewrite our understanding of what's out there. Have you ever noticed how every genuinely anomalous space event gets branded as normal? Within 24 hours, how every unexplained signal is dismissed as interference, and how the most intriguing data always seems to vanish behind classification walls or bureaucratic delays. It's a pattern so consistent you could set your watch by it. Before we pull apart the official story thread by thread, hit that subscribe button and join a community that actually questions the narrative instead of swallowing it whole. Because what we're about to discuss isn't just speculation. It's about asking why the most well-funded space agency on the planet suddenly went radio silent on the most interesting object to enter our solar system in years. So here's the drop. When 3I Atlas made its closest approach to Mars on October 2nd, NASA had every imaging tool pointed at it, captured quite a few frames, and then did something truly remarkable. Absolutely nothing. No press conference, no data release, no peer-reviewed analysis, just silence wrapped in the polite language of ongoing evaluation, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, "We'll get back to you," and then changing your number. Let's establish what we actually know, the baseline facts that even the most conservative astronomers can't dispute. 3I Atlas was officially discovered on July 1st, 2025. Its velocity, its angle of approach, and its orbital eccentricity all screamed, "Not from around here," and for a brief moment, the astronomical community was genuinely excited. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean statistically absurd. The object's trajectory brought it remarkably close to Mars, closer than any confirmed interstellar object has come to any planet in our solar system since we've been watching. The odds of an interstellar interloper passing that close to a planet on its first visit? Roughly 1 in several million, depending on whose calculations you trust. So we're already starting with an event that's about as routine as winning the lottery twice in the same week. But NASA's official stance remains that this is entirely within the realm of normal cosmic traffic patterns, which is the astronomical equivalent of your house being struck by lightning 3 times and the insurance company calling it standard weather activity. Now let's talk about what happened during that Mars flyby, because this is where the official story starts to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. NASA had multiple instruments trained on 3I Atlas during its closest approach. We're talking about the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the MAVEN spacecraft, and possibly even assets they haven't publicly acknowledged. These are not low-resolution webcams pointed at the sky. These are billion-dollar instruments capable of detecting atmospheric composition changes from orbit, capturing images with resolution down to individual meters, and analyzing spectral signatures with extraordinary precision. And yet, 34 days later, we have seen exactly 0 images, 0 spectral data, and 0 meaningful updates beyond the initial trajectory calculations. When Loeb pointed this out during the Rogan interview, he didn't mince words. He called it earthly stupidity, suggesting that either bureaucratic inertia or deliberate obfuscation is preventing crucial data from reaching the scientific community that could actually analyze it without institutional bias. For me, the most suspicious part isn't just the lack of data release. It's the complete absence of even preliminary findings, because in the modern era of space science, radio silence this long is not standard protocol. It's a choice. Here's what makes this particularly fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean deeply suspicious. Avi Loeb is not some fringe conspiracy theorist broadcasting from his garage. He's the former chair of Harvard's astronomy department, a tenured professor with over 800 peer-reviewed publications, and someone who has consulted for NASA on multiple projects. When someone with those credentials publicly accuses the agency of withholding data, you don't get to dismiss it with a hand wave and a reassurance that everything is under review. Loeb's central argument is elegantly simple and devastatingly difficult to refute. If 3I Atlas is just another garden-variety comet or asteroid on an unusual trajectory, then releasing the data only confirms the mundane explanation and everyone moves on. But if the data remains locked behind classification protocols or lost in bureaucratic limbo, the only logical conclusion is that someone, somewhere, saw something in those images or spectral readings that doesn't fit the tidy narrative they've been selling to the public. And before you say, maybe they're just being thorough, ask yourself this: when have you ever known a government agency to sit on scientifically mundane data for over a month without even a preliminary statement? The answer is never, because mundane data doesn't require careful PR management. It requires a press release and a pat on the back for another successful observation. Let's dig into the specific anomalies that Loeb highlighted, because this is where the official explanation starts to look less like science and more like damage control. First, There's the object's shape and tumbling behavior. Early observations suggested an elongated or irregular geometry, similar to Oumuamua, that other interstellar visitor that caused such a stir back in 2017. Now, irregular shapes aren't inherently suspicious. Plenty of natural objects are oddly shaped. But when you combine that irregular geometry with the object's rotation rate and reflectivity variations, you start to see patterns that are difficult to explain with simple, "it's a comet." Loeb has spent years arguing that Oumuamua's acceleration away from the sun couldn't be fully explained by outgassing, the standard mechanism that propels comets, and he suggested that its movement was more consistent with a thin, sail-like structure catching solar radiation pressure, which is a polite way of saying it might have been propelled by technology we don't possess. With 3i Atlas, he's seen similar red flags in the data that is publicly available, and he's pointedly asking why the data that could definitively settle the question, the high-resolution Mars flyby observations, remains conveniently unavailable. It's all normal, entirely expected, and, in their words, completely routine, which is exactly what you'd say if you were trying very hard not to say anything at all. Then there's the chemical signature question, and this is where things get genuinely strange. Comets have predictable spectral signatures: water ice, carbon monoxide, various organic compounds, all the usual suspects you'd expect from a dirty snowball that's been hanging out in interstellar space for millions of years. But according to the limited spectroscopic data that was released in the first 2 weeks after detection, 3i Atlas showed some unusual absorption lines that didn't quite match the standard comet template. Now, unusual doesn't automatically mean artificial, but it does mean interesting. And interesting data is exactly the kind of thing that scientists normally publish papers about within weeks, not the kind of thing that vanishes into a bureaucratic black hole for over a month. Loeb's argument is that if those chemical readings were just a bit odd but ultimately explainable, we'd already have 5 competing papers arguing about which combination of ices and minerals could produce that signature. The fact that we don't, the fact that the discussion was essentially shut down after the initial detection phase, suggests that someone decided the conversation was getting too interesting for comfort. And for me, the real tell is how quickly the initial excitement in the astronomical community turned into professional silence. Because scientists love a good mystery right up until the moment they're told to stop asking questions. Let's talk about what Loeb said regarding the potential impact of discovering extraterrestrial technology, because this is where the stakes of the cover-up, if that's what this is, become genuinely staggering. During a Rogan interview, he laid out a scenario that's both thrilling and terrifying. If definitive evidence of alien technology were confirmed, the cascading effects would reshape everything from financial markets to geopolitical power structures virtually overnight. Think about it. Every major industry, from energy to transportation to defense, would suddenly be operating with the knowledge that advanced technology exists, which could render their entire business model obsolete. Every government would be scrambling to understand the implications for national security, for resource allocation, for humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy. Loeb's point is that the stakes are so astronomically high that the temptation to suppress or control the information isn't just understandable, it's practically inevitable. And this is why the data lockdown on 3i Atlas matters so much, because if those Mars observations revealed something genuinely anomalous, something that couldn't be easily explained away with conventional science, then the decision to keep it classified isn't about following protocol. It's about deciding who gets to know that we're not alone and when they get to find out. Now, I want to be clear about something because intellectual honesty is what separates us from the people who blindly accept official narratives without question. Loeb himself has said there is no definitive proof that 3i Atlas is artificial or extraterrestrial in origin. His argument is more nuanced and frankly more damning than a simple "it's aliens" declaration. What he's saying is that the hypothesis of extraterrestrial technology should be on the table as a serious scientific possibility, investigated with the same rigor we apply to any other hypothesis, and that refusing to consider it because it makes people uncomfortable is not science. It's ideology masquerading as skepticism, and the fact that NASA is withholding the very data that could help settle the question one way or another is, in Loeb's words, actively harmful to the pursuit of truth. It's the scientific equivalent of a detective refusing to look at security camera footage because they've already decided who the suspect is based on a hunch. So when people ask me, Do you really think NASA is hiding evidence of alien technology? I always respond with a better question. Why are they hiding anything at all? Because transparency doesn't protect a mundane explanation. It proves it. Secrecy, on the other hand, only makes sense when you've got something to protect. Here's where the timeline becomes particularly important, and where we can see the pattern of institutional control at work. In the first 48 hours after 3I Atlas was detected, there was genuine scientific buzz press releases, preprint papers, excited speculation about composition and origin. Then, as the object approached Mars and the most valuable observational window opened, the information flow began to slow. Initial trajectory updates came regularly, then sporadically, then not at all. The promise of high-resolution imaging from the Mars orbiters was mentioned in several early reports and then quietly dropped from subsequent updates. By the time of the October 2nd closest approach, the story had essentially disappeared from mainstream science coverage, replaced by the usual fare of black hole discoveries and exoplanet confirmations. Important work, certainly, but conveniently less controversial. And now, 34 days later, we're in this bizarre limbo where one of the most credentialed astronomers on the planet is publicly accusing NASA of a cover-up, and the agency's response has been nothing. No rebuttal, no clarification, no promise of forthcoming data, just professional silence and the hope that public attention will drift to the next shiny object. It's a strategy that works remarkably well most of the time because most people aren't paying attention closely enough to notice when the questions stop being answered. What do you guys think? Which piece of official data on 3I Atlas seems the most suspicious to you? For me, it has to be the complete communications blackout after the Mars flyby, because that's not how modern space science works. When you have successful observations of a rare event, you publish preliminary findings. You share raw data with the international community. You let 1,000 independent analyses bloom. The fact that none of that happened suggests someone made a very deliberate decision to keep this particular investigation in-house, and I can't think of a single innocent explanation for that choice that doesn't involve either spectacular incompetence or something genuinely paradigm-shifting in those observations. Let's consider the broader context of how NASA and other space agencies have historically handled potentially revolutionary discoveries, because this pattern didn't start with 3I Atlas. It's been building for years. Remember the "wow" signal from 1977, the strongest narrowband radio signal ever detected from space, which remains unexplained to this day but was quickly dismissed as probably being terrestrial interference, despite no one ever proving that explanation? Or the dimming patterns of Tabby's star, which showed light fluctuations so bizarre that even conservative astronomers briefly entertained the megastructure hypothesis before settling on the more comfortable, probably dust, explanation without definitive proof. Or the phosphine detection in Venus's atmosphere, which was announced with great fanfare, then walked back, then partially confirmed, then buried under so many caveats that most people stopped paying attention. The pattern is always the same. Initial excitement, growing evidence of something anomalous. Then a sudden pivot to mundane explanations that don't quite fit all the data but are nevertheless presented as settled science. And we, the public who fund these missions with our tax dollars, are expected to nod along and trust that the experts have it all figured out, even when the experts themselves are publicly disagreeing about what the data shows. It's a system perfectly designed to prevent paradigm shifts, because paradigm shifts are messy and uncomfortable and difficult to control. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night, and it should keep you up too. We're living in an era of unprecedented technological capability for detecting and analyzing celestial objects. Our telescopes can spot planets orbiting stars thousands of light years away. Our spectrometers can determine the chemical composition of distant atmospheres. Our gravitational wave detectors can sense cosmic collisions from the edge of the observable universe. And yet, when an object from interstellar space passes through our own cosmic backyard, close enough to Mars that we could practically reach out and touch it with our existing spacecraft, we somehow don't have any meaningful data to share with the scientific community after more than a month. That's not a technology problem. We have the technology. That's not a funding problem. NASA's budget is measured in tens of billions. That's a decision problem, a deliberate choice to keep information centralized and controlled rather than distributed and analyzed. And the only reason to make that choice is if you're afraid of what decentralized analysis might conclude, because 1,000 independent scientists asking questions is much harder to manage than a small internal team working under institutional protocols and non-disclosure agreements. Loeb's courage in speaking out on this cannot be overstated, because academic scientists live and die by their reputation within the institutional framework. Accusing NASA of a cover-up is not a career-enhancing move. It's a calculated risk that could easily result in professional isolation, loss of grant funding, and dismissal from mainstream scientific discourse. The fact that he's willing willing to take that risk tells you everything you need to know about how seriously he takes this issue and how certain he is that the data is being deliberately suppressed. And before anyone tries to paint him as a publicity-seeking contrarian, remember that his concerns about Oumuamua, which were ridiculed by many of his peers when he first raised them, have become increasingly mainstream as more analysis has been done on that object's anomalous behavior. The man has a track record of being right about things that initially sounded crazy, which is precisely why his current accusations about 3I Atlas should be taken seriously rather than dismissed out of hand. When someone with 800 publications and decades of experience at the highest levels of astronomy tells you something is wrong, the burden of proof shifts. It's no longer on him to prove the conspiracy exists, it's on NASA to prove it doesn't, by releasing the data and letting independent verification happen. So where does this leave us? Standing here on November 5th, 2025, more than a month after the closest approach, and a week after Loeb's bombshell interview, we're left with questions that have clear answers. Answers that are sitting on servers somewhere in NASA's network, answers that could be released tomorrow if someone had the institutional courage to do it. We're left with an official narrative that asks us to believe in a coincidence so statistically improbable that it borders on mathematical impossibility, and to accept that narrative without seeing any of the evidence that could actually prove it. We're left with one of the world's most respected astronomers publicly stating that earthly stupidity is preventing humanity from understanding what might be the most important discovery in our history, and an institution that responds with silence rather than transparency. And perhaps most tellingly, we're left with a public that's increasingly aware that when it comes to potential evidence of non-human intelligence, the official channels cannot be trusted to tell the full truth. Not because everyone involved is malicious, but because the implications are so staggering that institutional self-preservation kicks in automatically, protecting the status quo rather than pursuing the truth wherever it leads. The data exists. That much is certain. It was collected on October 2nd when 3I Atlas passed Mars, captured by instruments that have proven their capability on countless previous missions. The question is not whether NASA has the information, but why they're choosing to keep it locked away from independent analysis. And until we see that data, until it's released to the broader scientific community for verification and debate, the only reasonable conclusion is that it contains something they don't want us to know. Not because they're evil, not because they're part of some grand conspiracy, but because the truth is more disruptive than the comfortable lie we've been living with for the past month. And that should terrify and excite you in equal measure, because we're standing at a moment in history where the next data release could change everything, if only someone had the courage to press the button and let the world see what they've been hiding. So keep watching this space. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding transparency from the institutions we fund and trust with our collective search for knowledge. Because the universe is not going to slow down and wait for bureaucracy to catch up, and the next interstellar visitor might not give us a month to argue about data policy before it disappears back into the cosmic ocean. Subscribe, share this with someone who still believes official explanations without question, and join the conversation because this story is far from over, and the final chapter might be written not by NASA's press office, but by the collective pressure of people who refuse to stop asking why.